Hey guys, tonight we're taking a gentle stroll back in time to the medieval era. Now I know what you're thinking. Silk gowns, fancy feasts, whispered secrets beneath flickering candlelight. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, what if I told you that those silk sheets weren't quite as luxurious as they seem? Picture yourself lying in a canopy bed, draped with the finest embroidered fabrics, the air thick with the perfume of incense. And just as you're about to drift off, you feel a little pinch, then another, and another. Congratulations, my friend. You've met your bedfellows for the night. Fleas. Loads and loads of fleas. And if fleas alone weren't enough to discourage you from romanticizing medieval courtesan life, here's a cheerful thought. You probably wouldn't survive the reality anyway. Yeah, sorry about that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time, because hey, I love knowing where people are when I'm gently crushing their historical fantasies. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you sink deeper into your supposedly luxurious bed, the reality sets in that medieval mattresses weren't exactly memory foam wonders. In fact, historians note that many beds were stuffed with straw, wool, or even dried peas. Dried peas. Imagine tossing and turning on a sack filled with crunchy legumes. It's more snack aisle than comfort zone. To make matters worse, hygiene was a flexible concept back then. Bed linens were changed about as often as medieval peasants took baths, which, spoiler alert, was not very often. Sure, as a courtesan, you might have access to finer linens, but clean linens were a privilege, not a guarantee. Those exquisite silk sheets you see depicted in paintings might look stunning, but in reality, they trapped moisture, heat, and insects beneath their shiny surfaces. Silk doesn't exactly breathe like your favorite cotton t-shirt, so your nightly rest would often turn into a sweaty, itchy nightmare. And speaking of itchy nightmares, let's talk about those fleas again. Historical records often describe how medieval bedrooms were essentially insect sanctuaries. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, you name it, they all loved the warm, undisturbed environment of luxurious beds just as much as you would hate sharing it with them. So, not only would you be counting sheep, you'd probably start naming your fleas out of sheer boredom. Good night, Sir Itch-a-Lot, sweet dreams, Lady Scratchington. Now, before you assume this itchy situation was only limited to the poorer folks, think again. Wealthy households weren't exempt. In fact, the higher your social status, the heavier and more elaborate your bedding became, often layered with expensive furs and heavy velvet curtains, providing a cozy fortress for tiny, uninvited guests. Historians still argue whether courtesans truly enjoyed any advantage regarding comfort compared to the nobility they entertained. Some scholars suggest courtesans had more freedom to change bedding frequently, while others argue that changing sheets was still considered extravagant and rare, reserved for royalty during special occasions. Either way, medieval bedding practices ensured that no matter how wealthy or influential you were, an insect-free sleep was nearly impossible. To combat the persistent biting and scratching, medieval people often used herbal sachets filled with lavender, mint, or wormwood beneath their pillows. It's a charming notion, imagining yourself drifting off surrounded by the delicate scent of lavender. But here's the quirky twist. Some folks genuinely believed lavender's strong aroma would not only deter insects, but could also ward off evil spirits. Because, you know, fleas apparently had demonic backup plans. And speaking of quirky medieval beliefs, there were some truly creative attempts at pest control. One medieval guide suggested scattering ashes from burnt cucumber vines under beds to drive away bedbugs and fleas. Yes, burnt cucumber vines, because nothing says sweet dreams like sleeping in vegetable ash. Another particularly fascinating method was placing bowls of water around bedposts, believing fleas would hop off your sheets straight into their watery graves. Spoiler alert, fleas are annoyingly good jumpers, and this probably just made the bedroom floor a little swampier. Now imagine trying to maintain your seductive charm after spending half the night itching and scratching. Medieval courtesans had to look flawless despite their sleepless battles with bugs. The next time you envy a courtesan depicted lounging gracefully in a luxurious bed, remember there's likely an unseen horde of tiny roommates driving her quietly insane beneath that composed surface. So tonight, as you sink into your own cozy, pest-free bed, spare a grateful thought for modern hygiene, and maybe check twice for unwanted guests just in case. After all, history has a funny way of reminding us just how much we take comfort for granted. Now, assuming you finally managed to fall asleep, despite the relentless flea circus beneath your sheets, let's move on to another delightful part of medieval courtesan life: the supposedly lavish meals. Picture yourself sitting at an ornate table, laden with exotic fruits, roasted meats glazed with honey, and decadent pastries dusted with rare spices. Candles flicker softly, wine flows generously, and the air is filled with the sounds of polite conversation and faint lute music. Sounds heavenly, right? Well, let's burst that romantic bubble real quick. Fine dining in medieval times was more like culinary Russian roulette. For starters, medieval food preparation wasn't exactly FDA approved. Those lush, elaborate banquets might look great on paper or illuminated manuscripts, but sanitation standards weren't just lax, they were practically non-existent. Kitchens were often situated disturbingly close to livestock areas, and cross-contamination wasn't a concern. It was practically tradition. That lovely roasted pheasant you're eyeing might have been prepared on the same cutting board used earlier to chop up something decidedly less appealing. Even if your food miraculously avoided being seasoned with invisible germs, preservation methods were sketchy at best. Refrigerators? Forget about it. Meat was often salted, smoked, or pickled to extend its life, which sounds tasty until you realize those methods didn't always prevent spoilage. They just disguised it. It's not exactly comforting to consider that your elaborate meal might just be artistically arranged, slightly expired food. And let's not overlook spices, those coveted, expensive, flavorful additions that medieval Europeans literally went to war over. Spice wasn't just a flex of wealth, it was a strategic way to mask the taste of food that had passed its prime. The richer you were, the more heavily spiced your meals, meaning as a courtesan dining with nobility, you'd be ingesting meals doused in enough cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg to overpower any unsavory aftertaste, though probably not enough to prevent a midnight dash to the medieval equivalent of a bathroom. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval diners often believed that spices had medicinal properties, so eating a heavily seasoned meal wasn't just about flavor, it was about staying healthy. Pepper, for example, was thought to aid digestion and prevent colds. Meanwhile, cinnamon was considered good for heart health. Of course, nobody back then bothered to mention how often those very spices masked the onset of food poisoning symptoms. But hey, at least you'd have a fragrant stomachache. Now, food poisoning might sound unpleasant enough on its own, but here's the kicker. Medieval medicine wasn't exactly reassuring. Doctors, or what passed for doctors, often diagnosed illness based on humor theory, believing your health depended on balancing bodily fluids like blood, bile, and phlegm. Feeling nauseous after dinner? Clearly your humors were unbalanced. Time for some therapeutic bloodletting. Yes, nothing cures food poisoning quite like losing a pint or two of blood. Historians still argue whether medieval diners understood the link between spoiled food and illness, or if they simply accepted periodic bouts of sickness as unavoidable, like medieval traffic jams or overly talkative bards. Some records suggest awareness that certain foods were more dangerous than others. Shellfish, for instance, was already known to cause sickness. But given how casually people embraced risky culinary practices, it's hard to be certain how seriously they took these warnings. And let's talk about table manners, or rather the lack thereof. You might envision refined gatherings with polite chatter and dainty bites, but medieval dining etiquette was wildly different. Forks were rare. Most people ate with their hands or personal knives. Imagine reaching for a juicy roast, only to find a fellow diner's greasy fingers already digging in. No serving spoons in sight. Your romantic dinner suddenly feels more like feeding time at the local petting zoo. Even high-ranking courtesans dining at the finest tables faced another problem: toxic tableware. Many medieval dishes were glazed with lead to make them shinier and prettier, because who doesn't love that subtle metallic gleam with their stew? Chronic lead poisoning was an everyday reality for those who regularly enjoyed meals off these deceptively beautiful plates. So, ironically, the fancier your tableware, the worse your health probably was. But let's lighten the mood with a quick joke. Why did medieval nobles love banquets so much? Because it gave them the chance to demonstrate their wealth through extravagant waste. Lavish feasts regularly involved dishes meant purely for spectacle rather than eating, such as peacock served whole, with feathers reattached after cooking. Sure, it looked magnificent, but can you imagine being the person tasked with carefully plucking feathers, roasting a bird, and painstakingly sticking the feathers back on again, only for no one to eat it? Medieval culinary artists must have had impressive patience or terrible stress levels. Probably both. So the next time you're tempted to romanticize medieval banquets, remember, fine dining in the Middle Ages meant more than elegant settings and fragrant spices. It meant a minefield of potential stomach troubles, lead poisoning, and questionable hygiene. But hey, at least your plate would sparkle, right? Tonight, as you savor your midnight snack or tomorrow's breakfast, take a moment to appreciate modern refrigeration and food safety standards. Trust me, your stomach will thank you later. Now that you've survived the perils of dinner, congratulations on avoiding lead poisoning, by the way, it's time to talk medieval fashion. Oh, those gowns, rich brocades, silks embroidered with golden thread, layers of velvet so heavy you could practically bench press your wardrobe. Sounds elegant and dreamy, doesn't it? Well, dear listener, glamorous medieval dresses might have been stunning, but let's face it, breathing comfortably is kind of important too. As a medieval courtesan, fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was practically your full-time job. Your attire had to be spectacular enough to turn heads, elevate your social status, and subtly communicate wealth and influence. Unfortunately, those impressive dresses came at a pretty steep physical cost. Imagine slipping into a gown so heavily layered and tightly fitted that breathing becomes less of an automatic bodily function and more of a strenuous aerobic activity. One popular medieval fashion trend was the tightly laced bodice, a predecessor to the corset. Sure, it accentuated your figure, but the constant compression around your ribs didn't exactly encourage deep, relaxing breaths. You'd spend entire evenings feeling like someone was gently squeezing your ribcage with a vice. Charmingly suffocating, isn't it? And speaking of charming, medieval women often padded their hips and bosoms to create exaggerated hourglass figures, because nothing says romance like strapping on enough padding to double as protective armor. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval dresses were often designed without pockets, which is ironic, considering you had to carry all sorts of little essentials, from perfume vials to handkerchiefs, tucked discreetly into hidden folds or secret pouches sewn into the seams. That's right, even in medieval times, the struggle for practical pockets was real. So, next time you curse your tiny jeans pockets, spare a thought for your medieval sisters juggling their valuables beneath pounds of brocade. But practicality aside, comfort wasn't exactly a priority. Rich fabrics like silk and velvet might look sumptuous, but they were typically heavy and lacked breathability. On a warm summer evening, you would literally be melting beneath your ornate garments. Sweat was a constant companion, especially since frequent bathing was frowned upon by medieval doctors who feared it might upset your humoral balance. Yes, apparently smelling good was considered risky business. Better stick to heavy perfumes to mask your true scent. And let's talk about those fragrances for a moment. Medieval perfume wasn't exactly Chanel No. 5. Common scents included rosewater, lavender, musk, and civet, a secretion harvested from glands near a civet cat's. Well, let's just say it's not the friendliest extraction process. If you're ever feeling nostalgic for medieval romance, just remember, people willingly dabbed cat gland secretions onto their wrists in the pursuit of smelling irresistible. Charming, right? Historians still argue whether medieval courtesans genuinely enjoyed these elaborate fashions or if they merely endured them as part of their social obligations. Some scholars suggest the lavish gowns were empowering status symbols, a clear signal of influence and independence. Others, however, argue that these constricting fashions were more symbolic of societal pressures, an outward display of conformity rather than personal expression. Whatever the truth, one thing's clear. Medieval fashion was undeniably taxing physically and emotionally. As if suffocating bodices weren't enough, let's consider the footwear. Medieval shoes for women often came with extremely pointed toes, called poulaines. While fashionable, they were also incredibly impractical, causing frequent tripping incidents. Because what's more elegant than face-planting at a royal ball? In fact, some regions actually passed laws restricting shoe length, not out of health concerns, but simply because fashion trends had gotten too absurd, even for medieval sensibilities. And to keep the mood light, here's a gentle jab at medieval fashion victims. Why did courtesans wear such long, elaborate sleeves? Well, historians suggest it was partly to demonstrate wealth. Fabric was expensive, after all, and partly because sleeves were often used like modern-day handbags. A medieval courtesan might discreetly stash letters, jewelry, or even snacks inside voluminous sleeves. Next time you see someone in an oversized sweater, maybe give them a knowing nod. They're clearly just channeling their inner medieval influencer. But jokes aside, consider this. Every moment spent in restrictive, heavy clothing was also a subtle negotiation with discomfort. Medieval courtesans didn't just wear their outfits, they survived them. They gracefully endured the constant pinch of lacing, the sweltering heat beneath velvet layers, and even the inevitable insect bites that came with dresses rarely laundered. Imagine maintaining flawless poise and alluring charm while secretly longing to rip off your gown at the first opportunity and dive into the nearest cold bath. Humoral balance be damned. So tonight, as you slip into your cozy pajamas, relish that soft cotton and elastic waistband. Enjoy the freedom to breathe deeply, stretch comfortably, and appreciate just how far fashion and common sense has come since the medieval era. Now, if you've managed to survive suffocating gowns and flea-infested beds, you might think you've conquered the worst of courtesan life. But don't get too comfortable. Next up is an even deadlier challenge, navigating the treacherous waters of court gossip. You might assume the greatest threats in medieval palaces came from assassins hiding daggers beneath cloaks, but the reality was far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. Picture yourself strolling elegantly through the halls of a grand medieval court. Candles flicker, musicians play softly, and courtiers whisper politely behind fluttering fans. Every glance, every smile, every casual remark is carefully measured. It's like high-stakes poker, but instead of chips, you're betting your reputation, livelihood, and sometimes even your life. Welcome to court politics, where words were weapons sharper than any dagger. Courtesans weren't just companions. They were influencers, diplomats, and sometimes spies. Your role wasn't simply to charm, but to navigate and subtly shape the complex web of alliances and rivalries within the royal circle. One wrong word, a misplaced smile, or even a perceived slight could send you spiraling into social oblivion faster than you could say, "Was that taken out of context?" Consider, for example, the court of Louis XIV, famed for its dazzling extravagance and ruthless intrigue. Courtesans and mistresses wielded incredible influence, but also faced constant scrutiny. Being favored by royalty was like walking a tightrope above a pit filled with hungry courtiers, just waiting for you to stumble. And trust me, nobody was there to catch you if you fell. Historians still argue whether courtesans genuinely enjoyed this power or secretly despised the constant vigilance it required. On one hand, it gave them unprecedented influence over political decisions and social movements. On the other, it meant a life spent constantly guarding every word and gesture, endlessly second-guessing motivations, intentions, and alliances. Courtesan life, in this sense, wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. Speaking of exhausting, let's talk about how quickly favor could shift. One day you could be dining at the king's table, the next exiled to a convent because someone whispered into the royal ear that you'd smiled too warmly at the wrong nobleman. Medieval courts thrived on whispered conspiracies and coded conversations, a social minefield more intricate than modern-day social media drama. Gossip wasn't merely idle chatter, it was currency. And sadly, your reputation was the bank account that everyone else had access to. Here's your quirky tidbit. Courtiers developed clever strategies to protect their conversations from unwanted eavesdroppers, using secret languages, coded hand gestures, and even fans as discreet signaling devices. A fluttering fan held near the heart might mean affection, near the lips, a warning to remain silent. Of course, misinterpreting those signals could be disastrous. Imagine accidentally pledging allegiance to your rival because you misread a fan gesture. Awkward. And speaking of awkward, imagine being caught up in court intrigue without even realizing it. Medieval courtesans often found themselves unwilling pawns in political chess matches. A simple invitation to tea could become a diplomatic incident. Every compliment could mask jealousy, every gift might conceal an ulterior motive, and every smile could hide betrayal. Social life at court was less tea party and more psychological thriller. Let's add another historical layer here. Medieval diplomacy frequently involved courtesans acting as secret emissaries. They often carried messages between nobles and even nations, their roles crucial, but their safety always precarious. If discovered, the consequences could be severe: exile, imprisonment, or worse. It's one thing to risk social embarrassment. It's another entirely to risk being accused of espionage. You might wonder how anyone kept track of it all. Who was friend or foe? Which alliances were trustworthy? Who whispered truths and who murmured deceit? The answer, sadly, was often that they didn't. Betrayal was commonplace. Trust was fleeting, and maintaining your place at court meant continuously adapting, never truly relaxing. It was survival of the most observant, the quickest thinker, and the best pretender. And here's a joke to ease the tension a bit. How did courtesans stay sane amidst constant intrigue? Simple. They probably didn't. Humor aside, mental exhaustion was likely very real. Imagine spending every waking hour decoding hidden meanings, managing alliances, and suppressing your genuine emotions in favor of the carefully curated persona you presented at court. You weren't just living your life, you were performing it non-stop, with zero room for error. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, appreciate the simple honesty of your day-to-day interactions. Enjoy the freedom to express yourself openly without fear of secret plots or whispered betrayals. And maybe, just maybe, spare a sympathetic thought for those medieval courtesans who smiled gracefully through relentless suspicion, forever guarding their hearts and minds behind a carefully constructed mask. So here you are, wearing a velvet gown that weighs as much as a small dog, fanning yourself with one hand while subtly dodging both fleas and political sabotage. You've dined cautiously, smiled diplomatically, and avoided a dozen social landmines, all before dessert. At this point, you might be wondering, was there any part of being a courtesan that actually lived up to the romanticized image we've grown up with? Well, kind of, but not really. The truth is, the romantic image we have of medieval courtesans, those elegant, witty women lounging on silk cushions, adored and protected by noblemen, is more myth than memory. While courtesans did sometimes wield great influence, their status was always unstable. One misstep, one bad rumor, one change of royal favor, and you could fall faster than a knight knocked off his horse. The reality of their lives was a constant tightrope walk between admiration and annihilation. Courtesans were often highly educated, fluent in poetry, music, and multiple languages, and expected to be endlessly entertaining. You weren't just eye candy, you were an intellectual sparring partner, a therapist, a strategist, and a confidant. And yet, despite all that effort, you were rarely afforded the respect or permanence of a noblewoman. You were essential but disposable, treasured yet replaceable, desired but not always defended. Historians still argue whether courtesans found empowerment in their roles or simply learned to survive in a system that valued their wit and beauty, but only within rigid boundaries. Some evidence suggests that certain courtesans accumulated wealth and property and even maintained private households. Others, however, were entirely dependent on the whims of their patrons, left vulnerable when those patrons died, lost influence, or simply grew bored. And the emotional toll, let's not skip over that. Imagine building deep connections, only to see them broken by necessity, politics, or reputation. You weren't allowed to fall in love freely. Courtesans often had to mask genuine emotion with polished charm, quietly nursing heartbreaks while maintaining a flawless facade. You might spend years becoming someone's closest companion, only to be publicly dismissed when alliances shifted. There's a strange melancholy to that kind of existence, being known but never truly seen. You were a mirror reflecting someone else's desires, not a window into your own soul. Even your rare moments of independence came with strings attached. Wealth had to be guarded, enemies had to be watched, lovers had to be managed. But here's your quirky fact for the night. Some courtesans wrote memoirs. A few of these texts survive today, offering glimpses into their worlds, not as fairy tale figures, but as complex women with sharp minds, dry humor, and biting insight. One even complained about how exhausting it was to always be interesting at parties. Relatable, right? And for one final joke, what did the courtesan say when asked about her job security? Depends entirely on who's winning the throne this week. So if you've made it this far in the story, if you've survived the sleepless nights, the risky meals, the medieval shapewear, the whispered gossip, and the emotional minefields, you've earned more than just a good night's sleep. You've earned a reminder that history's most glamorous roles were often built on silent suffering, razor-sharp intelligence, and a daily battle for dignity in a world that rarely offered it freely. Wind down 300 words. Now gently let go of the court's echoing chambers. Let the flickering candlelight fade from your mind, the heavy gowns slip away, the whispers quiet. All that remains is the steady breath of nighttime. You're no longer walking carefully along the marble halls or pretending not to notice jealous glances. You're safe now, far from the games, the performances, and the weight of elegance. In this quiet space, there are no rumors to fear, no gestures to misread, no favors to keep track of. Just the softness of your bed, the hush of the night, and the warmth that still lingers from knowing something new about a forgotten world. Take a deep breath now. In, out. Let your chest rise without restriction. No corsets, no expectations, just you and the slow rhythm of sleep. And as you drift off, maybe keep one small thought in the back of your mind. Not about the dresses or the danger, but about the resilience, the cleverness, the quiet power in being able to survive a world not built for you. That's the part they don't paint in portraits, but it's the part that lingers. So sleep gently now. You've traveled far tonight, not just through time, but through the space between myth and truth. You're safe, you're still, you're free. Good night. You step off the main street and into a side alley in Edo, what you call Tokyo, if this world were yours. But it's not. It smells different, feels different. The lanterns don't flicker from neon lights, but from soft candle glow. And the world you're about to enter doesn't operate through brute force or big speeches. It moves on whispers, painted smiles, and the soft rustle of silk. You stand in front of a machiya tea house, the kind with bamboo slats and a door too low for any ego to walk through upright. You duck, step inside, and suddenly you're not in a tea house. You're in a government office, or, well, what passes for one here. Because in this reality, diplomatic negotiations aren't done in marbled halls with grumpy men in wigs. They're done here on tatami mats, with warm tea, steady eye contact, and people so graceful they make politicians look like toddlers mid-tantrum. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not twisting your arm or threatening a rice tax. Yet. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Midnight in Minneapolis, 2:13 a.m. in Oslo. Just drop it below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your feet press lightly against the tatami. The paper doors close behind you with a sigh, and the air shifts. A woman approaches. No, glides. Her kimono is soft lavender, patterned with silver cranes that seem to move when she does. You're greeted not with words, but a nod, deep, calculated. Every muscle in her neck seems to say something. You bow back, unsure what you're agreeing to, but you're pretty sure you've just signed something binding. In this reality, the entire diplomatic structure of Japan, and now the wider world, has evolved through the culture of geisha. Trained not just in music and etiquette, but in politics, languages, and cultural psychology, they've replaced bureaucrats entirely. Men in armor still exist, of course, but they carry clipboards now. Because here, violence isn't the currency of power. Understanding is. You're ushered into a small room, 4 walls, no windows, and a low table already set with tea. On the cushions across from you are 2 figures, one in a French-style waistcoat, the other with a German accent thicker than the lacquer on your cup. Both are sweating bullets. You're not. Yet. The geisha pours tea. 3 drops spill precisely. 1 toward the Frenchman, 2 toward the German. She smiles at you. This is how discussions begin. No opening statements, no handshakes, just patterns, symbols, rituals. Historians still argue whether the original geisha system truly had political aspirations, or if this alternate world simply let their subtlety take the spotlight history usually reserves for loud men with swords. But what's clear is this: it works. Wars don't erupt, they dissolve, slowly, like sugar cubes in tea. You watch the woman now as she adjusts her obi mid-conversation. It's not fidgeting, it's a coded signal. Your eyes dart to the wall scroll behind her, a scene of koi swimming upstream. A reminder, maybe, that going against the current is noble, or dangerous, or both. There's a fact here you didn't expect to learn while sipping tea. In the real Edo period, many high-ranking geisha were educated in Chinese classics, poetry, and political philosophy. Some were even employed as spies. Which explains a lot about the precision with which this one just shut down the Germans' territorial claim, using only a half verse of waka poetry and a knowing glance. A fringe theory, found in one obscure 1980s Japanese magazine, suggests that several geisha lineages secretly passed down diplomatic codes, generation to generation, hidden in dance patterns. Is it true? You're not sure. But the way the room freezes when the geisha taps her fan against the rim of her teacup tells you something real is being said. You just don't speak fan. Yet. And still, despite the elegance, it's intense. You feel it in your bones. The tension here doesn't shout. It whispers, like a smile that hides a dagger, like a folding screen painted with birds. Beautiful, but always blocking something. No one's raised their voice, yet you've witnessed 4 diplomatic slaps, 2 subtle insults and 1 complete reversal of a trade agreement, all without a word. You try to lean back. Bad move. The geisha's glance catches you just briefly, and you snap forward like a student who just got called out mid-nap. You don't know what rule you broke, but you're certain it was one. The session ends, not with applause or signatures, but with a bow so deep it nearly touches the mat. And just like that, the men leave, pale, dazed, and oddly respectful. You stay a moment longer. The geisha looks at you. She tilts her head, and suddenly, you're not in control anymore. You never were. The next morning, you're back in the same room, though the light is softer now, filtered through paper screens that catch the rising sun like parchment on fire. You're seated where the Frenchman was yesterday. Bad luck, maybe. Or maybe intentional. In this world, nothing is random, especially not where you sit. Today's meeting hasn't started yet, but it has. Because in this alternate Japan, diplomacy doesn't start when people start talking. It starts when someone folds a napkin wrong, or fails to notice the incense burning sandalwood instead of jasmine. Everything is a message, especially what isn't said. She enters again, the same geisha, or perhaps a different one. It's difficult to tell. The kimonos change, but the presence is the same. Calm, unreadable, dangerously intelligent. She walks across the room with the pace of someone measuring your reaction in fractions of heartbeats. You barely blink, but you feel it. You're being read like a poem, left in the rain. Nothing obvious remains, but the emotional ink is still visible, if you know where to look. She sits, tucks her legs beneath her, then opens her fan. Now the meeting really begins. In this reality, fans are the first language of politics. A flick upward signals disagreement, closed fan, neutrality, tapping the fan against one's palm. That's the geisha equivalent of, "Are you kidding me?" You've trained, of course. Well, you crammed. Your diplomatic brief included 2 pages on fan protocol and a 10-minute video. But as soon as she starts moving, you realize how outmatched you are. Her gestures aren't just graceful. They're a full lexicon, honed from centuries of performance and political maneuvering. It's not just body language. It's language. You blink at the wrong time. She notices. She sips her tea, left hand not right, a subtle cue that she expects you to cede the opening offer. So you do, clumsily. And now you're playing catch-up. A quirk of this world's system? Negotiations are often conducted entirely in silence for the first 30 minutes. Just fans, glances, and the order in which tea is poured. It's mesmerizing, also exhausting. You feel like you're in a live-action Sudoku. You've been briefed on how this all came to be. In this alternate timeline, during the late Edo period, a massive diplomatic scandal between rival domains nearly triggered civil war. The male envoys were locked in a shouting match for weeks. It was only when a respected Kyoto geisha, Yuzuki, was brought in to mediate that peace was restored, without a single raised voice. That single event sparked a revolution in conflict resolution. By the turn of the next century, the role of geishas had expanded beyond entertainment and art. They became essential interpreters, then mediators, and finally, the full-fledged conductors of diplomatic harmony. Historians still argue whether this transformation was a natural evolution of their role, or a calculated shift orchestrated from within the Hanamachi, the geisha districts, who'd grown weary of being underestimated. You shift on the cushion. Your legs are falling asleep, but the rest of you is wide awake, because across the table she just dropped her fan. Not clumsily, deliberately. Silence. That's big. In this world, a drop fan is the equivalent of calling for a recess or a duel. You don't know which. She reaches slowly, retrieves it with a dancer's grace, and, just before she opens it again, she locks eyes with you. It's your move. So you mimic her earlier gesture. Sip tea with your left hand, fold your napkin precisely, tap once on the mat with your ring finger, off script but intentional. She smiles, a small one, but it's real. Somewhere in the room, behind a screen you hadn't noticed before, a low chime rings out. That's the signal. The invisible observers, the true decision-makers, have heard enough. They'll make their ruling tonight in private. And you get to leave. Not triumphant, not defeated, just released like a butterfly they've examined and decided not to pin down. Yet, you step outside, blinking against the daylight. The city hums, as always. Vendors shouting, children laughing, rickshaws squeaking on cobbled alleys. But now it all sounds muted. You've just survived a conversation where no one spoke. A dance of fans and teacups that decided the fate of regional trade. And no one outside these walls will ever know what really happened. You remember reading that real-world geishas could tell you everything about a guest, status, intention, even mood, based only on how they stepped into a room. You didn't believe it. But now you wonder if this world got it right. If diplomacy was never meant to be about speaking louder, but about listening harder. Later that evening, with your legs finally recovered and your ego slightly bruised but intact, you're invited to a different tea house, more secluded, less ceremonial. You duck under another low doorframe and are immediately met with a wave of incense and the low drone of a shamisen being tuned somewhere out of sight. The building leans with age, its beams cracked just enough to whisper secrets. This isn't where guests are entertained. This is where plans are made. You're not alone. 3 other figures sit across from you, one with the unmistakable posture of a daimyo's cousin, one you vaguely recognize from yesterday's fan duel, and one with the stillness of someone who's far too used to getting away with everything. And in the corner, her again, the geisha, or maybe another, you still can't tell. They blend deliberately in this world, moving through rooms like scents you can't place but never forget. She nods. You nod. She nods again. It's not a formality. It's code. Tonight, you're not attending diplomacy, you're inside it. In this alternate world, the public face of negotiation, the tea house rituals and fan ballet is just the tip of a much deeper game. A hidden network of geisha, trained from adolescence in everything from espionage to emotional manipulation, operates in the shadows, not as assassins or saboteurs, but as choreographers of fate. Historians still argue whether the real-life geisha districts were ever centers of covert influence. Some claim they were mere entertainers with no political sway. Others point to cryptic diaries, intercepted letters, and the occasional sudden retirement of a key advisor. But here, in this reality, there's no debate. The geisha are the government. A soft knock, a side door opens. 2 more enter, this time in Western clothing. An American with a southern drawl and a British gentleman who looks like he's been time-traveled from 1842. They bow poorly. The British man nearly topples over. The American grins like he's about to sell you a railroad. They're late to the party, and they don't realize it's not their party anymore. The geisha clears her throat, barely audible, but the entire room freezes. She lifts a tiny scroll from her sleeve, unrolls it on the table. 5 names, 3 dates, 2 symbols you don't recognize, but that clearly means something to everyone else. One man inhales sharply, the others stay quiet. You stare blankly until you realize what's happening. She's not showing a schedule. She's showing leverage. The scroll isn't ink on paper, it's insurance, proof of favors owed, secrets known, alliances tested and folded into the lining of silk sleeves. It's the real treaty, the one no embassy has seen, the one that's constantly rewritten without ever touching a pen. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Her glance moves from man to man like a lazy breeze across rice fields. And with each pass, someone nods. Not in agreement, but in resignation. She's won. Again. And then she looks at you. No smile this time. You swallow, wondering what she knows about you. What tiny moment you thought was private, an ill-timed sigh, a half-second hesitation. She might have recorded like a court stenographer of the soul. You shift uncomfortably. The American chuckles and slaps the table. Well, I guess that's that. It's not, because after he speaks, there's a pause. Just long enough to let him feel confident, and then she laughs. A soft, melodic sound, almost imperceptible, but devastating. The British man straightens his tie. The daimyo's cousin stares at the scroll like it's a prophecy. It is. A mainstream historical fact. In real-world Edo Japan, while geisha were officially barred from direct political influence, many wielded soft power through their patrons, men who ruled provinces but couldn't outmaneuver a single glance from across a fan. A quirk from this reality? A weekly gathering known as evening silence, where decisions are made in total quiet. No voices. Just visual cues, coded movements, and the occasional strategically timed sneeze. You attend one. It's terrifying. You leave the meeting exhausted, your mind buzzing. You feel like you've run a marathon using only your peripheral vision. Back on the lantern-lit streets, a few men stumble out of a sake bar laughing. They shout, they argue, they wave their arms like banners. You notice how much noise men make when they're not in charge. And in the corner, near a closed tea-house gate, the geisha stands, or perhaps waits. You bow. She does not return it. Instead, she opens her fan once, slowly, deliberately, and then vanishes into the night. You realize with a quiet thrill that this world doesn't belong to warriors or politicians or even kings. It belongs to those who've mastered the art of silence. You don't sleep that night. Not because of fear, though there's a little of that, but because your brain won't stop replaying the movements, glances, silences. The way power glided across tatami like a shadow you couldn't quite catch. You're starting to understand why no one really explains diplomacy in this world, because explaining it ruins it. You rise before the sun and are summoned again, this time not to a tea house. You follow a narrow path down the side of a stone garden, through an arch so small it feels symbolic. At the end of the path is a wooden gate, old, splintered and unmarked. A private estate. You're let in without a word. The courtyard inside smells like wet pine and ink. This is no public place. It's a training ground, and the people here, they're not performing. They're preparing. You're led to a covered corridor and seated behind a screen, not to speak, just to witness. A lesson, perhaps, or a warning. The floor of the central room is wide and empty. A single cushion rests at the far end. She enters again, your silent guide, your constant disorientation, and kneels on the cushion without fuss. Her hair is tied up differently now, stricter. She doesn't look like someone orchestrating treaties. She looks like someone ready for war. Quiet war. Across from her enters another geisha, slightly younger, stiffer, too precise. A student, maybe. Their exchange begins not with bows, but with movements, an opening dance of opposition. Not literal dancing, though it resembles that, but calculated ritual. Hand to chest, fan to floor, gaze to the left, pause, respond. Repeat. You realize they're practicing offense, not verbal sparring, but the choreography of psychological dismantling. One gesture brushes off another like wind against silk. Another parries with a deeper bow, a longer pause. The older geisha breaks the rhythm and blinks twice, so subtly it seems accidental. The student falters. That blink wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. Historians still argue whether such complex nonverbal codes could have been codified in real Edo Japan. Skeptics say the symbolism we project onto these rituals today is just retroactive romanticism. But watching this now, you're certain, in this world, the code is real, and it's lethal. The training ends in total stillness. The younger one bows deeply and leaves, clearly chastised. Your guide remains kneeling, her back straight, unshaken. You're ushered away before she moves again. You're starting to see the layers now. Public tea houses for performance, private salons for influence, training courtyards for precision. But tonight, you'll see the most dangerous layer of all. A banquet. And not just any banquet. A midnight gathering hosted by the regional magistrate himself. Foreign dignitaries will be present. Wine will flow. Laughter will echo. And absolutely nothing that matters will be said aloud. The estate is lit entirely by lanterns. Their warm glow gives everything a soft edge, like history remembered through dream fog. You're dressed in borrowed robes, seated between a Korean envoy and an overly fragrant Dutch merchant who doesn't understand silence and keeps filling it with nervous chuckles. Your geisha, yes, you've started calling her yours in your head, though you know better, stands at the far end of the room, observing. She hasn't acknowledged you yet. Musicians play in the corner, food is served, but you can barely taste it, because suddenly the atmosphere shifts. One of the Japanese nobles, red-faced from sake, begins to rant. Loudly, inappropriately, he bangs his fan on the floor, insists on a change to a shipping route agreement, one that would severely disadvantage the Korean delegation. The room stiffens. The Korean envoy blinks once, exhales through his nose. The Dutchman next to you has stopped chewing mid-bite. Your geisha steps forward. No words, just a slow, deliberate walk to the center of the room. She lifts her fan and covers her face, then lowers it, then raises it again, slightly off rhythm. It's not a performance. It's a correction. Her fan drops to her side. A second geisha, one you hadn't noticed until now, mirrors her motion from across the room. Together, like mirrors folding inward, they form a perfect silent axis between the Korean and the Japanese sides. The noble stops talking. She kneels beside him, refills his cup, gently turns it clockwise before handing it back. He looks confused, then ashamed, then very, very quiet. The tension unravels. You don't fully understand what just happened, but you do. A subtle realignment, a removal of shame through a gift, a reminder of hospitality, a silencing of ego. The geisha just prevented an international incident by turning a sake pour into a reset button. A quirky note from the historical record: geisha in real Japan were sometimes asked to resolve interpersonal disputes between patrons. Not through mediation, but through perfectly timed comedy, song, or distraction. In this reality, that role has expanded into political alchemy. The banquet resumes. She passes by you on her way back to her post. Her eyes linger on yours for half a second. This time, you don't look away. The next morning, the air is damp and still. A fine mist hugs the rooftops like a sleeping cat, and the stones under your feet feel cool, almost alive. You're summoned again, this time not to observe or negotiate or stumble through a coded fan exchange. This time, you're here to witness the fold. That's what they call it. The end of a cycle, the sealing of an agreement, the quiet moment after the storm, when all the motion ceases and something real is written, softly, permanently, into the fabric of this alternate reality. You arrive at a nondescript house on the outskirts of Edo. From the outside, it looks like nothing. Inside, it feels like everything. The room is bare, no scrolls, no cushions, no tea. Just one long piece of silk laid out across the floor like a frozen river. A single ink brush sits beside it. She enters, the geisha you've followed across rooms, through rituals, across this entire dream. She doesn't greet you. She doesn't need to. You bow, and this time she bows back. You watch in silence as she kneels beside the silk. Her hands hover over it, not touching, just sensing. Then she begins to write. Not words, not kanji, not anything you recognize. It's movement. She paints in gesture. The ink is light, almost translucent, and the brush dances across the fabric like breath. You realize she's not writing a treaty. She's inscribing everything that happened, every gesture, every misstep, every subtle turn of diplomacy. This is the final record, not for the public, not for governments, but for those who really run things here. This world believes that memory isn't something you speak, it's something you fold into fabric, into tradition, into silence. A mainstream historical fact. The Japanese art of katasome, dyeing patterns into fabric using rice paste and stencils, was used not just for decoration, but for storytelling, with each kimono sometimes carrying hidden family histories. In this world, the same principle applies, but politically. Each diplomatic encounter is preserved, not in speeches, but in silk. She finishes the last stroke, then folds the silk once, then again, then a third time, tucking it carefully into a wooden box that looks older than anyone in the room. She closes it, stands, faces you. "It's done," she says, her voice finally. You didn't expect it to sound like that. Soft, certain, with just enough steel to remind you who held the room every single time. She walks past you and leaves the house. You're not asked to follow. You step outside. The mist has lifted. The city exhales. A boy runs by carrying a bag of rice. A woman sets out a tray of pickled plums for sale. A cat stretches on a rooftop and returns to its nap. Life resumes. You glance back at the house. Nothing marks it. Tomorrow it might not even be there, but somewhere, folded in silk, this day is recorded. This fragile piece, brokered not by threats but by gestures and tea, has found its place in the world. And you've changed. You walk differently now, slower, not out of tiredness but awareness of your body, your breath, the space you occupy, the weight of silence, the power of restraint. You remember something the geisha never said but always communicated. Power isn't loud, it's patient and beautiful and utterly terrifying. You pass by a group of men arguing over tariffs. They shout, wave papers, stomp. You smile. They'll never know they've already lost. The walk back is long, but soft. The stones seem less sharp beneath your feet. The noise of the world, once jarring, now sounds like a lullaby you understand for the first time. You find a quiet bench beneath a flowering tree. The petals fall lazily, with no sense of urgency. You sit, you breathe. A breeze lifts your hair and carries the faintest scent of sandalwood. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings. Not loud, not demanding, just present. The sun filters through branches, breaking into gold on your skin. You feel it, the stillness, the weight of what you've witnessed, folding itself inside you like silk tucked into a sleeve. A new way of seeing things, of being. You think of her, of the fan that never needed to open fully, of the ink that barely stained the silk, of the look that said everything and nothing. Your eyelids grow heavy. The world around you softens. The lines blur, not in fear but in comfort. It's okay not to know every signal. It's okay not to speak. It's okay to rest. And so you do. As the wind hums through bamboo, as the lanterns sway on unseen strings, as your breath finds its rhythm again, you are safe here, quietly changed, quietly watched over. Imagine Paris, but hush-hushed. A city without gossip, without glances passed over wine glasses, without the scent of perfume carrying secrets between velvet curtains. Tonight, we ask, what if Parisian courtesans never held salons? What if no one whispered, "Did you hear what the Duchess said after the champagne?" What if society's secrets had nowhere to go? Now I know what you're thinking. How bad could silence be? Well, here's your first reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this version of Paris, not socially at least. Without salons, you'd be adrift in an ocean of unread letters, missed cues, and fashionably dull dinners. Think less Moulin Rouge and more waiting room in Versailles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Otherwise, the courtesans definitely wouldn't invite you back. Also, I want to know, What time is it where you are? And where exactly are you listening from? Type it down below. Let's see how far this little circle of candlelight reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking into Paris, but not the one you've read about. No velvet sofas pulled close around flickering hearths. No rose-scented evenings where philosophy, poetry, and pillow talk blend into one swirling candlelit monologue. Instead, this city sounds like heels on stone and nothing else. Conversations are brief. Lips stay shut. Nobody's leaning in to whisper a scandal. And no one's leaning out of a balcony to pass on what they just heard. In this alternate world, courtesans are still courtesans, beautiful, clever, and underpaid. But their homes remain closed. No salons, no soft lighting, no mingling of nobles and misfits over claret and veiled threats. And without them, Paris loses her voice. The salon wasn't just a space, it was an ecosystem. The finest gowns rustled there, sure, but so did politics. Power was exchanged through innuendo, carefully timed laughter, and the subtle lift of an eyebrow. Without that, aristocrats retreat to their estates, artists stare at blank pages, and social climbers? They keep climbing but with no rope and no one watching. Mainstream history tells us that salons shaped public opinion before revolutions ever did. Madame de Pompadour didn't just sip tea, she whispered advice to kings. Her gatherings were strategic affairs with lace and lipstick, where ministers mingled with playwrights, and the real business of empire happened between sighs. But here, she's just a mistress. No influence, no networking, no invitations. And it gets weirder. You notice something almost eerie. Without the salons, the rhythm of the city shifts. People are less interested in ideas and more obsessed with protocol. Without gossip to soften it, truth becomes sharp. Memos replace murmurs. Declarations take the place of double entendre. And dinner parties? They feel like business meetings where no one gets fired, but everyone secretly wants to. Now here's a quirky side effect. Perfume sales plummet. Turns out, if no one's gathering to flirt and flex social muscle, fewer folks bother scenting their elbows with crushed iris petals. Instead of jasmine and musk filling parlors, the city smells of ink, horses, and rain-drenched stone. Which, I mean, sounds romantic until you're stuck sitting next to someone who smells like they walked through an 18th century tax ledger. Historians still argue whether courtesans truly steered history or merely accessorized it. But one thing's clear, without their salons, the ambient intelligence of Paris dims. Facts stop swirling, ideas don't cross-pollinate. A revolution might still come, but no one's prepping anyone with wit and wine beforehand. And as for you, you find yourself craving anything interesting, one scandal, one rumor, one stupid aristocrat caught in the wrong boudoir, but all you hear is the scratch of quills and the clink of wine glasses that accompany silent meals. Even the fashion changes. Without salons as showcases for daring new styles, people lean conservative. Corsets stay tighter, wigs grow duller, stockings stay firmly on ankles where no one bothers to pretend they accidentally slipped. It's not prudishness, it's just apathy. Nobody's watching, so why perform? And as you stand in this version of Paris, watching the lamps get lit on streets that never seem to whisper, you realize something. It's not just the courtesans who lost their voices, it's the city itself. Paris, once a gossiping grande dame, now sits quietly in the corner, sipping lukewarm wine and not telling you what she's really thinking. You're still walking through this mute version of Paris, and something's starting to gnaw at you. Not fear exactly, just a low, creeping dullness. You pass a mansion with golden filigree on the shutters, but no lights behind the windows. You hear the sound of carriages, but not the laughter, not the voices spilling out into the foggy evening. It's like everyone forgot how to lean in close and whisper. Now remember those salons we've erased? Without them, politics gets a little awkward. No more seductive conversations between the glittering elite and the sly minds of the city. Courtesans used to be matchmakers of ideas and ambition, weaving words like lace, tugging strings that connected nobles to poets, generals to philosophers. And now, that web is gone. Let's talk about the powerful men. The ones who normally found themselves in velvet-draped rooms, listening to women smarter than themselves explain how to win hearts and wars. Without that, they're stranded. Imagine a count trying to interpret public mood by reading dusty parliamentary records, instead of getting the latest pulse from a courtesan with a smirk and a strategic blush. Painful, right? And the power dynamic changes, slowly, then all at once. The men still hold titles, the women still have charm, but the two stop colliding. Without Salons, influence isn't shared over fanflicks and half-muttered Latin. It's documented, cold, official, and deeply inefficient. Mainstream history tells us that during the reign of Louis XV, women like Madame du Barry didn't just entertain, they guided, shaped taste, art, conversation, and yes, even policy. Their salons were think tanks in silk, but here, those spaces never open. And with them closed, those whispered warnings and encouragements never reach the men making decisions. Bad decisions multiply. The revolution arrives sooner and bloodier. You step into one of the grand government halls now. The air is stale, thick with cologne and confusion. Ministers debate reforms, but there's no softness in their words, no echo of charm. Just stiff suits and ticking clocks. Without the tempering influence of clever courtesans, the tone turns rigid, paper replaces poetry. France doesn't breathe. She counts and calculates and frowns. Here's a fringe tidbit you'll like. In our timeline, courtesans were unofficial liaisons, literal go-betweens for rival political factions. Their beds were safer than confessionals. Now, without them, secrets don't travel. Or worse, they travel clumsily. Leaks happen not with sly intent, but with tragic misunderstanding. Someone misreads a treaty. Someone else overreacts. Wars begin not with cannon fire, but miscommunicated footnotes. And yet, the power still wants somewhere to go, so new intermediaries rise, priests, lawyers, accountants. Yes, you heard right. Accountants now advise princes on matters of mood. If that doesn't chill your blood, you're probably one of them. But here's what's weird. You notice people forget how to talk sideways. Courtesans taught the art of saying one thing while meaning another. Without them, language becomes brittle. Every insult lands hard. Every compliment sounds suspicious. Irony, dead. Sarcasm, dangerous. Jokes, extinct. You overhear a man at a cafe trying to discuss a trade agreement, but it sounds like a military speech. You miss the days, our days, when a little laughter could lubricate a diplomatic standoff. When a courtesan could chuckle, toss a plum at a general, and accidentally prevent a war. And remember those corridors of Versailles, where nobles once whispered strategy while pretending to admire a vase. Now they stand there in silence, genuinely admiring the vase, for hours, because they don't know what else to do. Historians still argue whether courtesans were orchestrators or just ornaments. But in this version of history, their absence becomes a hole you can't stop noticing. Everything feels off-kilter. The city's timing is wrong. The rhythm lags. Decisions are made with clumsy hands, untempered by wit, warmth, or womanly warning. It's like living in a perfectly written play, with no one daring to improvise, and Paris, poor thing, grows nervous. Not angry, not rebellious, just jittery. When people can't speak freely, or slyly, or seductively, they start to forget how to speak. They draft memos instead of verses. They issue orders instead of questions. And when the silence grows too much, they explode. You sit in a cafe watching a pair of minor nobles argue over a budget allocation. One spills wine, the other knocks over a chair, but no one laughs. There's no audience, just awkward silence and the creak of old wood as everyone pretends they didn't see. And you think, how did a city that once pulsed with the murmur of 1,000 little secrets become this? Then you remember, they never opened the salons. You shift in your seat. The cafe is cold now. Not physically, but socially. No shared glances, no chuckles hiding in sleeves. The waiter sets your drink down without a word and vanishes. You look around and realize no one's reading novels. No one's scribbling verses. The very idea of being clever seems to have dried up like old ink in the bottle. Because without salons, the writers never found their fire. It's strange to think that literature could suffer just because a few women never hosted some candlelit soirees. But here you are, watching a poet stare blankly at his notebook, as if the muses packed up and left town. In our timeline, salons were incubators. Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, yes, those guys. They weren't just tortured souls writing in garrets. They were frequent guests of witty women who edited their thoughts mid-sentence, rolled their eyes at their weaker metaphors, and made sure their ideas had polish before hitting the press. Now, without those salons, you get pamphlets, not plays, speeches, not stories, long-winded, humorless, painfully literal prose. You know that moment when someone tries to tell a joke and you can hear it dying halfway through? That's the new French literature, everywhere. Mainstream history often overlooks the salon as a literary crucible, but the absence is glaring now. Plays are stiff, no double entendres, no flirtations woven into dialogue. Writers are scared, not of censorship, but of indifference. They don't know what makes something sparkle because no one's there to applaud mid-sentence or gently roast their laziness with a laugh and a raised glass. And art suffers too. Portraits grow formal. Landscapes dominate galleries. The human subject fades, not out of modesty, but because no one's bold enough to say, "Darling, you'd look magnificent draped in scandal and moonlight." Without courtesans suggesting poses, playing patrons, or daring to be immortalized in oil, everything becomes safe. You walk past a print shop. The window displays are bland. Political cartoons exist, but without bite. Satire used to be sharpened at those salons, tested in small circles before reaching the masses. Now, no one takes that risk. Humor, too risky. Irreverence, too messy. Everything gets polished, approved, sterilized. And here's the quirky twist. Language itself tightens. In our world, salon culture birthed idioms, clever turns of phrase, even entire vocabularies based on suggestive wit. In this world, the dictionary is shorter. Words are blunt, descriptive, functional. No poetry, no layers, just beige. You start to miss flirting. Not in a romantic way, just the kind of verbal fencing where someone says one thing, means another, and everyone's in on the dance. Now it's just speeches, straight lines, paragraphs with no cheeky nudge. And it shows in the people. Lovers can't woo, friends can't tease, enemies can't even insult each other creatively. Everything's delivered with the emotional range of a spoon. Historians still argue whether the salon created genius or merely provided a platform. But in this quieter world, genius hides, or worse, it never emerges, because brilliance without audience becomes dust. You pass a little bookstore near the Seine. The clerk sits slouched behind a counter. You scan the shelves and realize all the titles are political essays, agricultural treatises, and one incredibly dull travelogue about the hills of Normandy. You don't know whether to cry or yawn. In our version of history, courtesans often funded struggling writers, slipped them gossip to twist into poetry, or gave them just enough heartbreak to fuel 10 sonnets. Without that, writers still exist, but their work is lonely, safe, unread. And here's the kicker. Without stories about love, betrayal, ambition, and moral ambiguity, the people themselves become simpler, less imaginative. They stop dreaming out loud. They stop confessing anything that hasn't already been approved by a council or a parent. The stories they do tell are warnings or instructions or tax rules. You sit on a bench outside the bookstore and imagine a world without Madame de Staël. No Germaine gently correcting Napoleon in public, no bold salon thinkers pushing the boundaries of social order. Just dusty men in dusty rooms writing dusty thoughts for dusty readers. And Paris, sweet, sharp-tongued Paris, starts to feel like she's asleep with her eyes open. No one dares to ask, what if? No one dares to write, what then? Because without the courtesans to coax the questions, inspire the metaphors, and laugh when the philosophers get too serious, the city just forgets how. And you? You sit there on that cold bench and realize that in a world without velvet whispers and scandalous stories, the loudest thing left is silence. You're starting to understand now. This world didn't just lose its gossip, it lost its flavor. You walk along the Seine, but the bridges feel less romantic. Lovers pass by, arms linked, but without the spark in their eyes, without the secret stories they might one day retell with a wicked smile. It's all handshakes and correct posture. Everyone seems to be playing a role they didn't audition for. And you realize, when the courtesans stopped hosting salons, the social map stopped curving. In our version of Paris, the salons twisted society like a ribbon. Class wasn't a wall, it was a curtain. Sometimes sheer, sometimes velvet, but always something you could peek through. A peasant poet might sip wine with a marquis. A noble might fall in love with a wit, boundaries blurred, not erased, but softened, reimagined. But here, the map is made of stone. Without salons to serve as crossroads for the unlikely, everyone sticks to their own. Nobles dine with nobles, merchants with merchants, artists, well, they usually drink alone. And those unexpected collisions that once sparked new movements, gone. Mainstream history might tell you the salons were just social clubs. But here, in this version of Paris, you see what happens when those clubs never formed. People forget how to mix. Everyone moves in a straight line, and while that might sound orderly, it feels oppressive. You step into a ballroom now. The chandeliers glitter, the orchestra plays, but the air is stale. Every dance is choreographed down to the blink. No one strays from the plan. No one dares to improvise. You watch a duchess nod politely at a viscount and think, there's no story here, just names, titles, movements. You long for scandal, for someone to lean in and say, did you hear what she wore to breakfast? But instead, it's polite weather updates and discussions about wheat prices. And remember how the courtesans once blurred love and power. Without that energy, without that intrigue, relationships become purely transactional. Marriages are arranged, affairs are discouraged, friendships are measured in favors, not affection. Here's a quirky consequence. Handwriting becomes boring. Seriously, in our world, salon-goers competed for flair, even in ink. Their letters curled and danced with personality. But now, with no need to impress, no one writes letters worth saving. No little notes hidden in corsets, no invitations to midnight rendezvous, just formal announcements in stiff calligraphy that all look like receipts. Historians still argue whether salons empowered women or confined them to decorative influence. But in this version of Paris, with salons erased, you see clearly, influence doesn't redistribute. It vanishes. Women stay home, men stay clueless. And the soft diplomacy once done over sugar-dusted pastries now tries to take place in courtrooms and council chambers. Spoiler, it doesn't work. You find yourself in a narrow alley behind a shuttered theater. Two young lovers are arguing in hushed voices. You listen, and it's painful. They don't know how to say what they feel. Their words are clumsy, like tools used wrong. Without stories to model on, without hearing others in salons express sorrow, jealousy, longing, they're stuck. They don't know how to confess. You almost want to interrupt and say, look, just quote Racine and be done with it. But Racine never got read aloud at a salon here. So they fumble, they part ways, and the story that might have been never even begins. Back on the main street, you pass by a paperboy calling out the headlines. The top story, a change in trade policy. You sigh. In our Paris, someone would have twisted that into a satire within hours. A scandal would erupt. A song would be written. But here, the news is cold. It lands flat, no teeth, no twist. And then it hits you. The city didn't just lose its salons. It lost its imagination. Those smoky little rooms once connected art, love, scandal, revolution, fashion, and power into a messy, glorious knot. But now that knot never ties. Everything's separate, everything's neat, and somehow that makes it all worse. You step into a dressmaker's boutique. The gowns are technically exquisite, embroidery perfect, cuts flattering. But they're missing something: flair, risk, identity. No one's dressing to be remembered, just to be accepted. Because if no one's watching, if no one's whispering, then who are you really dressing for? The shopkeeper says nothing as you leave. Just a nod, no compliment, no comment, no opinion. And that's the problem. The city once known for her voice, the city of songs, debates, and scandalous letters, is now a city of silences. Every laugh, every rumor, every whispered poem that never was. It echoes here like a ghost with nowhere left to haunt. You don't even bother with the umbrella anymore? Parisian rain used to feel poetic, like the sky was adding a mood, a soft blur to the edges of memory. But now it's just wet. The final piece settles in like fog behind your eyes. History in this quiet Paris doesn't just look different. It feels unfinished. Without salons, revolutions still happen, but they're colder, bloodier, stripped of nuance. There's no build-up of whispered unrest over wine, no velvet-laced resistance built through sly metaphors and dangerous jokes at candlelit gatherings. It all just erupts, abruptly, violently. The courtesans once helped aim the chaos. They shaped narratives, softened dogmas, warned kings without declaring war. Here, no such luck. The storm hits without warning, and no one sees it coming. Mainstream textbooks tell us that the Enlightenment was born in cafes and printed in pamphlets, but those ideas were nurtured in salons, in rooms where someone like Madame Geoffrin could stitch Voltaire's sarcasm to Diderot's defiance and lace them into fashionably subversive small talk. Now imagine a world where those threads never tie. The Enlightenment still happens, but it's fractured. Ideas don't gather strength in laughter. They get locked in academies. Reform comes slower, or worse, too fast and without support. And so France stumbles more violently into her future without knowing how to dress her wounds in wit. You walk past a theatre billboard. The title, On Fiscal Ethics and Civil Obedience. A comedy, apparently. The fact that no one is laughing tells you everything. And that's when the real loss hits you. Not just the salons, but the stories. Without the courtesans hosting salons, history becomes a monologue instead of a dialogue. The human part, the perfume, the flirting, the whispered betrayals, that's gone. And remember how art, literature, and fashion all lost their sparkle. Now it's philosophy's turn. Ideas, once born in laughter and batted around like fans at a masquerade, now come down as declarations. Final, unfun, unmovable. And with that, we come to the final irony. This version of history, with its rigid lines, its colorless courtships, its gossipless days, doesn't feel wrong. It feels like a warning. Historians still debate whether courtesans invented influence or merely wielded it more beautifully than the rest. But walking through this city without them, the answer becomes obvious. They were the unofficial archivists of mood, the translators of tension, the ones who could read a room and know which revolution would be romantic and which would simply burn everything down. In this quiet Paris, where salons never buzzed, revolutions still happened. But no one wrote about them beautifully. No one laughed as they plotted. No one remembered the people behind the doors, because there were no doors to open. And now, as you walk along the edge of this alternate timeline, this quieter, bleaker version of events, it finally fades, slowly, into dusk. You pause, and the city, once a chorus of clever sighs and strategic smiles, leaves you with silence. You're still with me? Good. Let's slow everything now. The streets behind you grow distant. The clatter of hooves fades. Even the rain, once sharp against cobblestone, turns soft like whispers in another room. You feel the world settling, gently folding inward. Inhale and exhale slowly. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension in your chest unwind. That other version of Paris, the one filled with candlelight, laughter, and scandalous poetry, it may have vanished tonight, but it lives somewhere deep in the folds of our memory, and in the stories we choose to tell. Even in silence, you carry the echo. So as you drift now into sleep, picture a single room, warm, glowing, filled with velvet and secrets. Imagine someone raising a glass, another leaning in to listen, a woman with sharp eyes and a softer voice turning a king's folly into a punchline. That room is waiting. No matter how history really unfolded, it's the human part we hold on to. The part with perfume, with tension, with barely whispered truths. So close your eyes. Let the fan hum. Let the quiet wrap around you like a silk robe no one's brave enough to wear anymore. And remember, even in a world without salons, you still have stories and someone to tell them. Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into silk robes, stepping past flickering oil lamps and brushing shoulders with the perfumed ghosts of ancient Athens. You're not heading to war or into a dusty amphitheater full of cranky philosophers. No. Tonight, you're going to a party, one of those parties. There's lyre music, wine so watered down it tastes like regret, and women who could ruin a man's reputation with a single wink. You're at a symposium, and no, not the boring kind where Socrates monologues for 7 hours. This one's hosted by a wealthy aristocrat, and tucked between marble columns and purple-draped couches are the real power players, courtesans, or as the Greeks called them, hetairae. But don't picture anything sleazy. Hetairae weren't ordinary entertainers. They were witty, educated, and, most dangerously, politically aware. While their counterparts, the wives of Athenian citizens, were shut indoors weaving and praying no one started a war, hetairae were out sipping wine with generals. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not about to send an army of toga-clad subscribers after you. Probably. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments, just so I know what parts of the globe are also refusing to sleep on a Tuesday. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle into the plush cushions beside an Athenian noble. His breath smells faintly of figs and ambition. Across from you, a woman in a seafoam green peplos leans forward, laughing at something whispered by a minor magistrate. That's Callisto. Charming, smart, and the reason 2 city-states recently accidentally exchanged gifts shaped suspiciously like weapons. The truth is, these women weren't just passively sitting around being beautiful. They were conduits of information. They heard things between toasts and flutes in moments when generals grew loose-tongued and politicians relaxed their public personas. Some say a single comment from a courtesan could reroute a treaty, or at least ensure a vote went the right way in the assembly the next day. And don't think the men didn't know. Everyone was pretending not to notice that half of Athenian diplomacy happened after midnight over sweet wine and laughter. You shift in your seat as another guest stumbles in, his laurel crown slipping. He nods to the hetaira beside you and blurts something about the Spartans being soft beneath their bronze. That's probably not going to age well. She smiles like she's heard worse, which, to be fair, she has. Mainstream history gives you dates, names, and battles, but it skips these soft moments where power whispered instead of shouted. Courtesans like Neaera and Thais weren't formally allowed into the courts or councils, yet their words trickled in via the men they enchanted. One fringe theory even suggests that the infamous Sicilian expedition, a disaster for Athens, was originally seeded during a private evening involving too much Retsina and a very persuasive courtesan with connections in Syracuse. Historians still argue whether that's true or just a slanderous anecdote, but when politics travels by rumor, you can't ignore the people who carry the rumors best. You reach for another fig and glance toward the doorway. There, half shrouded in shadow, stands a figure no one dares ignore. A hetera dressed in dark blue, her eyes scanning the room like she's keeping mental tabs on every whispered alliance. That's not just beauty, that's calculus. And suddenly you understand. In a city obsessed with logic and rhetoric, the most influential voice might not be the loudest, but the one who laughs at just the right moment. No one elected these women. No statues were built in their honor. But somewhere in the folds of their dresses and the cadence of their conversation, whole political movements tiptoed forward. The wine grows warmer and the night grows slower. You lie back, letting the buzz of conversation wrap around you like a thin blanket. You're not just a guest at this banquet. You're a witness to a hidden layer of history, one that smells like myrrh and sounds like laughter in the dark. You don't remember falling asleep, but the scene shifts. It's quieter now. You're in a dimmer room where the air feels thicker, warmer, like words cling longer before disappearing. Across from you, sitting upright with the stillness of someone who knows their every movement will be remembered, is Aspasia. She's not a shadowy figure. She's right there, her voice clear, her Greek precise, the kind that makes educated men lean forward. She was born in Miletus, not Athens, and that foreignness gave her something valuable, freedom from Athenian marriage laws. She couldn't become a wife, so she became something far more dangerous, a woman no man could own, yet many wanted to impress. You're not the only one watching her. That's Pericles beside her, yes, that Pericles, general orator, architect of Athens' golden age. He doesn't speak much tonight. He doesn't need to. She's speaking for both of them. It's hard to explain the tension in the room. Not sexual, no. Something more magnetic. She doesn't seduce with touch. She seduces with questions. What is justice, if not convenience with good lighting? She murmurs. The table laughs. Someone spills wine. But you catch the way a politician scribbles something into the folds of his robe. That line will show up in the assembly next week. Mainstream history remembers Aspasia as Pericles' lover. Maybe his wife, though Athenian law didn't recognize their union. But she was far more than that. She ran a salon, a place where men came not to be flattered but challenged. Socrates visited her. Some say she taught rhetoric. Others claim she ghost-wrote parts of Pericles' famous funeral oration. Historians still argue whether she merely inspired the words or put them directly into his mouth. You notice she rarely looks directly at anyone for long. Her gaze flicks through the room like a lantern scanning for cracks. A young man boasts about Sparta's military. Aspasia listens. Then, with one eyebrow slightly raised, she asks, "And do they know what they're fighting for, or do they just like the noise?" The boy flushes. The room chuckles, but the seed is planted. Someone will repeat that tomorrow, somewhere louder. She's a courtesan by label, but her methods are pure statecraft. You've heard of soft power. This is it, in real time. Not armies, not decrees. Just one woman making a man question his certainty. There's a small fringe claim, never proven, never disproven, that Aspasia once halted a conflict simply by suggesting privately that victory would cost more than dignity could afford. The war didn't happen. No one cited her, but no one forgot what was almost said in that salon. You look around and realize these gatherings are unofficial think tanks. The official debates happen on Nix Hill, sure, but the ideas are rehearsed here over olives and murmured insights. You see it clearly now. Athens had two stages, one for the voters and one for the muses. And the muses didn't wear laurels, they wore perfume and good questions. The most unsettling part It worked, and it still does. In every age, someone in silk is whispering behind someone in armor. Outside, the city buzzes, lanterns flicker. Inside, Aspasia smiles as someone else takes the floor. She's done for the night. She's placed the pebble. Tomorrow, the ripples will begin. You lean back, eyes heavy, and wonder how many wars never happened, because someone made the right person laugh at just the right time. You wake to the soft clink of a bronze wine cup against a marble step. The room has changed. Gone are the philosophical debates and rhetorical volleys. This gathering smells of politics now, sweeter, sharper, more dangerous. You're no longer watching ideas take shape. You're watching influence solidify. Pericles is here again, but this time he's pacing. His chiton is wrinkled, his brow furrowed. A courtesan, older than most, stands near a wide window, arms folded, gaze calm. Her name is Diomea. She's not famous, not the way Aspasia is, but within this circle she might be even more feared. Because Diomea doesn't ask questions, she tells stories. You sit back as the room hushes. Diomea begins recounting a tale from earlier that week, an offhand comment a certain military leader made while slightly drunk, deeply arrogant, and unaware of who was listening. The story is funny, yes, but also revealing. By the time she finishes, 3 men have gone pale. One adjusts his robe like it might hide him from consequences. You begin to realize the Salons are part gossip mill, part intelligence agency. Courtesans didn't just trade pleasure, they traded information. Historians rarely dwell on this. The archives focus on who held office, who passed laws, who commanded fleets, but they forget how fragile reputations were. A single rumor could unravel a campaign. A well-placed joke could bury a policy. And courtesans were the ones with front-row seats to every man's worst performance. The political structure of Athens was democratic, on paper. In reality, it was built on social connections, favors, reputation. A system like that is soft, permeable, and into that softness flowed the influence of these women. Take the case of Thais. She's better known for her escapades in later years with Alexander the Great's General Ptolemy, but her career began in Athens. Thais didn't just entertain guests, she arranged guests. She'd place a general beside a wealthy merchant, seat a philosopher between 2 ambitious sons of politicians. Then she'd sip her wine and let human nature do the rest. That's politics, without paperwork. Unfringed theory suggests that Thais once orchestrated an entire voting bloc by convincing 3 brothers to support a naval expansion they barely understood. Why? Because she said it would make them look heroic during festival season. Historians still argue whether she truly pulled that off, but the vote did happen. The funding was approved, and all 3 brothers died with statues on their family tombs. You can't help but smile. Ancient politics wasn't all shouting in marble halls, it was also whispering in scented rooms where no one kept minutes and everyone remembered everything. The joke of the night belongs to a wiry man with too much eyeliner and too few teeth. He suggests, loudly, that courtesans ought to hold public office since they already know everyone's secrets and most of the strategies. Diomea raises her cup. "We don't need offices," she replies. "We already have the keys." The room erupts. You sip your own wine, thin, warm, slightly sour, and realize that you're watching the other side of history unfold. This isn't the version sculpted in marble or inked on papyrus. This is the version shaped by reputation, arranged with charm, and sealed with laughter. Outside, the moon has shifted again. Inside, deals are forming without signatures, alliances without handshakes. It's all in the look, the pause, the way someone's story gets repeated just enough times in just the right tone. This isn't democracy with a capital D. This is democracy's shadow, where choices are made before the vote even happens. And the courtesans, they're not behind the curtain. They are the curtain. Soft, decorative, and essential. You lie back on the couch, letting the voices hum like distant bees. Somewhere, Pericles is finally sitting down, rubbing his eyes, muttering about taxes. Diomea leans close to a young man and says something you can't hear. He laughs, then pauses, then looks concerned. Another idea planted, another string pulled. You blink, and the room fades again, not into darkness, but into a softer space. The air smells of ink and myrtle, and you're now somewhere quieter. No banquets, no bluster, just the gentle scratch of a stylus on wax. You're inside a study, stone walls, low oil lamp and scrolls stacked like fragile secrets. A philosopher reclines on a low couch, absently chewing the end of a reed pen. Across from him sits a courtesan, barely lit by the golden flame. Her name is Theodote, and tonight she's the one guiding the dialogue. You may have heard of her from Xenophon, who recorded a famous interaction where Socrates, not one to fawn over women, actually visited her, not to lecture, but to learn. She asked him questions about virtue, seduction, and the art of persuasion. And in a rare twist, he didn't scoff, he engaged. That tells you something. These meetings weren't uncommon. Courtesans, hetairai, were some of the only women in Athens allowed to be educated, not just literate, educated. Geometry, rhetoric, music, even medicine. Some could quote Homer from memory. Others challenged the logic of men who built entire schools of thought. There's a quiet power here. It doesn't shout. It doesn't march in sandals. It lingers. Tonight, Theodote isn't talking about love. She's asking questions about justice. If laws are written by the powerful, and the powerful are influenced by affection, is justice truly blind, or just well-dressed? The philosopher doesn't have an answer. You feel the question curl in your own mind like smoke. Across the room, a group of younger students listens in. One takes notes, frowning. He'll later claim to have studied under Plato. But tonight, he's learning from someone history refused to name in marble. Courtesans weren't allowed into the academy, but their ideas made it in through the back door, folded into metaphors, whispered as inspired by conversation, attributed to unnamed muses. Scholars still debate whether entire philosophical frameworks owe their origin to these late-night conversations. Some call it romantic myth, others quiet fact. Historians still argue whether Plato's theory of forms drew from actual debates with these women, or whether his ideal world just happened to look a lot like the salon of a clever hetera. Outside, a nightbird cries. Inside, a fire crackles low. You realize the line between politics, philosophy, and poetry was never all that thick. It blurred here, in rooms like this, between minds wrapped in silk. And yes, the contradictions are endless. These women were excluded from citizenship, forbidden to vote, denied legal husbands, and yet they shaped the minds of the men who wrote the laws, gave the speeches, led the armies. Take Laius of Corinth, famous, expensive, reportedly able to silence a man mid-boast with a single sentence. She once refused to see a wealthy client because, she said, his hands had more ambition than his mind. He went home, wrote a tragic play, and somehow won a prize. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe her rejection shaped a work that shaped a culture. You look at the philosopher again. He's leaned forward now, completely absorbed. Theodote smiles, sips from a delicate cup, and asks, "What's the use of truth if no one desires it?" You shift in your seat. She's not just being clever, she's aiming at something. And now you're starting to understand how philosophy can grow from flirtation. The lamp burns lower. The scrolls rustle as someone rises. The discussion has ended, but the idea will linger. It will find its way into writing, then into lectures, then into history books that never mention the room where it was born. You feel yourself growing heavier now, like your thoughts are stretching into centuries. The past isn't made of wars and laws. It's made of rooms like this, lit by ideas, carried on voices too soft for statues. The walls are fading now, But the floor remains, mosaic tiles under your feet, cooled by night air drifting through arched windows. You're in a courtyard. Ivy clings to the stone, and in the distance you can hear someone humming an old island tune. The city sleeps, but the stories do not. You see her again, Aspasia, but older now. The gatherings are smaller, the guests fewer. Pericles is long gone. Some say she taught their son philosophy. Others say she was quietly exiled from polite memory, her name preserved only because too many powerful men had once listened to her. Around her, the younger courtesans sit in a circle. They listen, not with reverence, but with that subtle sharpness that says they too know the weight of words. One of them is writing something, poetry maybe, or a letter that will never be sent. You settle in the corner, your back to a column. It's cooler here, the fireflies are out, glowing faintly like ideas that refuse to die. Athens is changing, democracy is fraying. War has worn the city thin. Most of the men who once filled these salons are gone by death, defeat, or disillusion, but the women remain. They remember. And memory, especially memory shared by those excluded from marble and scroll, is a quiet form of rebellion. One woman, soft-voiced but sharp-eyed, speaks of a new general courting favor in Corinth. Another recalls a foreign envoy who, after 3 nights with a particular hetaira, changed his tone entirely on tribute demands. Were these women manipulating policy, or were they simply creating space for empathy? Historians still argue. What's clear is that without them, many of the ideas we now treat as sacred, freedom, justice, even beauty, might never have survived the dinner table. The legacy of the hetairae doesn't lie in statues or public honors. It lies in the shape of conversations, in the way ideas moved when official channels were blocked, in the words that slipped between cracks and took root anyway. You breathe in the scent of the garden, rosemary, oil, old wine. Someone laughs softly, someone else begins to hum again. These women were never meant to be remembered, but here you are, and here they are, still humming, still influencing, still shaping. Your eyes close, and you see their names drifting like ink in water. Aspasia, Thais, Neaira, Theodote, not conquerors, not rulers, but voices that changed those who ruled. And maybe that's the gentlest, most powerful kind of history there is. So now the courtyard fades. The ivy blurs into shadow, the lamps sputter to soft embers, and the hum of forgotten voices dissolves into the air. You're no longer seated beside marble columns or perfumed intrigue. You're just here, wherever here is, wrapped in the hush of midnight and the slow rhythm of breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts stop trying to categorize what was fact, what was theory, what was whispered centuries ago. None of it matters now. Not in the way candles matter when the stars are out. You walk through rooms most never saw. You listen to voices history tried to quiet, and now they've quieted for real. Not in defeat, but in peace. You carried their stories. That's enough. If you listen closely, maybe there's still laughter in the distance. Maybe a joke lingers, weightless as perfume, but it's not calling for you anymore. It's just part of the night. Take one last breath with them, then let it go. No more scrolls, no more speeches, just the soft shuffle of memory, folding itself back into sleep, and you, drifting gently behind it.